Good. All right, we're live. I got the thumbs up. All right, well, welcome everyone. My name is Brian Fonseca. I direct the Institute for Public Policy at Florida International University, and I am privileged, honored, there's probably some other words, to recognize the fact that I have the opportunity to have a conversation with Laura Delgado, who is the author of this incredibly gorgeous report, Mapping Space Security Concepts in Latin America. This report is online. I'm sure it's in the chat somewhere, or it will be. But this report is up and running, and it's part of our Institute's sort of initial push to expand our research and policy thought leadership in the area of space. And Laura's been at the tip of that for us. She's been, such an important part of us building out that capability at the university. And so we're really excited, to have this report come out, and more importantly, to have this conversation with you. And so I'm going to turn it over to Laura just to kind of talk a little bit about her background, from NASA scientist to senior fellow at the Institute to world-renowned expert on all things space Latin America. And then I have, we'll go for a conversation. I have some questions that I'll toss out there. We haven't done a whole lot of choreography, and so it's going to kind of be conversational. And we'll do that for maybe 20 minutes or so, 30 minutes. And then we'll take questions if anyone online or in the room has questions. If not, I'll go for another 2 hours and 45 minutes or so, and then we'll wrap up. But Laura, let me kick it over to you just for some opening thoughts.
Sounds good. I can stretch on my bio too. Thank you so much, Brian.
Oh, flex. You should flex.
I am originally from Puerto Rico, and I started coming to DC for grad school and internships and experiences like that. And so I have a degree in international science and technology policy from George Washington University. There's the Space Policy Institute, which is excellent. And then after I finished that degree, I stayed here and have about 15 years of experience, a little bit more than that, here in the DC space community. And so worked in nonprofits, a lot of international facing work, which is kind of what inspires a lot of this. Worked in industry, and then, as you said, had the privilege of working for NASA for 6 years. When I left last year, I decided to really pivot to focus on these areas of expertise that I had been kind of marinating for some time. I spent a year at CSIS, this Americas program, funded by a Council on Foreign Relations fellowship, and so really spent, had the privilege of spending a year thinking about space and Latin America. And so I said, I need to just go back to that. There's just so much going on, as you're aware of, and just an opportunity to both continue advancing research and drawing attention to the region, but then helping other thought leaders in the region kind of draw connections with some of the issues that impact us here in the United States as well.
Yeah, it's funny. I mean, I had my aha moment on space reading the work that you were doing at CSIS and looking at the wild imagery that you had put together in some pretty fascinating reports that we certainly consumed heavily. And I had that aha moment that space was no longer this kind of research domain. This is now a commercial and military domain. Mm-hmm. It is being operationalized, and it's moving so incredibly fast. And so there was this broad debate about sort of the geopolitical global space complex, mm-hmm. right? And looking at sort of U.S. and China competition to some degree through the prism of this new geopolitical competitive landscape. And so, we obviously were really interested in understanding the depth of that in Latin America, which is where I can proudly say you are now a senior fellow with us, with the Gordon Institute for Public Policy and FIU more broadly, to help us, again, build out that expertise and more importantly, provide thought leadership in the area of space policy in Latin America. And so this is among the first ventures that we take with your expertise, and so we're really excited. So I'm gonna I got a series of questions that Lexi Bishop put together that she thought would help steer a good conversation. So I'm gonna weave these in, and we'll see how far this gets us before we move to the audience. But to start us off, when we talk about space security, what do we really mean by space security? And how has the concept evolved over time, and to where we are today? And then I'll add, where do you think it's going?
Oh wow, I'll skip that last one. We'll get to that at the end. But you were talking about the work that the Institute does, and one of the things that attracted me to it, and that really framed my approach for this report is it's practical research, it's policy-oriented research, right? And so even though this is a lengthy kind of academic report in the sense that I'm quoting UN statements and things like that, there's a real-world implication. And so space security refers to, initiatives, efforts to protect space systems themselves, like from harm. And I say space systems quite intentionally because it's not just satellites, it's also the ground stations that are required to communicate with those systems. So the whole infrastructure, but then also it's the condition of the environment itself. And do you as an operator, whether you're a private company, team of university students or a country, whether you feel that you can operate safely or there's an expectation of harm, right? And so I keep it broad like that because then it helps you think about this is happening today. Concerns about space security are happening today. And so to bring it all together, I wanted to look at space security from a deep perspective to really understand a little bit more about the perspectives from the region, but because it's such a timely issue. So, that's what space security is, and as I said, we're seeing headlines and concerns from decision makers about some of the issues that impact space security.
So, can you unpack a little bit about sort of why that's important? I mean, against the backdrop, and I know your focus in this report was Latin America, but you look at the U.S. conflict in Iran and how important space has been just in the ability of military operations to, whether they've been disrupted on offense or defense, it's been so incredibly important seeing how vital space is into this multi-domain, multi-precision landscape from a military perspective.
So we saw space play a critical role in military operations starting in the 90s. But since then, it's really been a force multiplier, and it's just embedded in all of the activities that military forces undertake. But then, it's also what happens before and after in terms of, is it intelligence gathering? Is it understanding the displacement of people, right? And issues that have a broader security implication that are not just military or national security in that standpoint, right? And so
things like broadband internet and just the socioeconomic elements.
Telecommunications, exactly. And so, we use, for example, GPS and other global navigation satellite systems. We use them all the time just to get here, so I wouldn't get lost. Financial transactions, internet on the plane, the work I'm going to do on my flight to Argentina. But it's so embedded and it's so, invisible sometimes. But space security is about the disruptions to those systems that we've just continually relied on, whether it's for civil purposes, military or commercial, or more importantly, activities that blur the lines across all of them. And so some of the headlines and the issues we've been talking about is in the war in Ukraine and hundreds of cyber attacks that have impacted space systems in that conflict as well. And so I think what's good about that is it makes space security less of a theoretical conversation that people are just having in the UN to something that, you and I can be like, okay, wait, what would happen if my telecommunications was disrupted or I couldn't use these systems that I rely on every day?
Right. That's a great point. And so the work that you've done on this focuses more specifically on Latin America. And so I want to sort of think about that as we kind of charge into some of the findings. Why is Latin America so important when we talk about space governance? I mean, space governance is not a Latin America thing. This is a global phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
But your research focused very, intentionally on Latin America. Can you talk a little bit about space governance in Latin America, and why do you see that sort of, kind of, maybe even more prominent than other geographic localities?
Yeah, sure. So on the one hand, I think there's two parts to that question. On the one hand, the region I think is fascinating. There is a lot of history with space. Space started in countries like Brazil and Argentina in the 60s at the same time as it did in the United States and the Soviet Union. And so there's a rich history there to unpack. But then now it involves so many different actors. You do get private industry. You do get universities. You get these, what I describe as emerging ecosystems where there's a lot of pockets of expertise. They're not necessarily super well integrated or coordinated, which I think has impacts to some of the issues we're talking about. But the first part of answer is yes. I think the region is fascinating and interesting in its own right. I also think there are leaders in the region, thought leaders in the region, from the government and outside of government, that have had outsized influence in some space governance debates. I point out, for example, Mexico, Argentina, and Brazil were all founding members of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space in the UN, back in the late 50s. And so they've been engaged from the very beginning, and they've led a lot of the efforts to think about space security concerns, despite the fact that the capabilities may not be as extensive as other parts. So for that sense, it's fascinating to me. But the other one is, from a U.S. standpoint, Latin America is important. And so when I think about what's driving or what should drive U.S. strategy towards the region on space-related issues, I want to help inform that by, shedding some light on some of the complexities and saying, it could help advance U.S. goals in space security and in space governance more broadly to really bridge certain conversations a little bit better.
Yeah, and notwithstanding the importance of the Western Hemisphere in the national security strategy and sort of U.S.'s pivot to the region, and then building a coalition of nations in the region that are focused on kind of working through the governance issues around space, right?
Well, and a coalition around issues that we share concerns, that we share values, but also priorities. And so that really drove this, because I think space security is one of those issues where it seems like we, the United States, may not have a lot of alignment with actors in the region, but then when you look at it more closely, you're like, oh, okay, no, wait, it's more complex than that. And there are issues where I think a lot of the key players in the region are actually moving in a direction that is very complementary to how the United States views these issues.
That's a great point. And that, that builds on the next question about countries in the region have long histories in participating in this multilateral space governance. But how does diplomatic experience shape the way they approach space security today from a multilateral sort of political influence context?
Yeah, I think traditionally it's been very focused on advancing those conversations in the formal multilateral forums, especially in the UN. So the Conference on Disarmament is the UN body where disarmament issues, as the name implies, are discussed, right? So it's critical for nuclear issues, right? And nuclear concerns, as you know, have always been a priority in the region and really shaped also how a lot of these countries approach space questions and issues from the very beginning. And so, again, you think about certain countries in the region that maybe it's just now that they're having satellites or investing in space activities, but they've been engaged in the governance conversations from the get-go because of a concern about weaponization and letting space be another domain of conflict, right? And so we can talk about where that is right now, but I would say the diplomatic type of engagement has been shaped primarily by that concern, maintaining space as a peaceful domain, and really driving cooperation. And the cooperative part has been both a means and an end. It's been a means for countries with limited resources, not just money, but also just capabilities, right, to develop, to gain access to technologies, but then also, again, a way to promote that space should be peaceful and space should align with these other principles. And so all of that has shaped how they engage diplomatically. And I think as some of these issues have gotten more complex over time, I think from the outside it looks like, oh, we the United States, have very little in common with these postures. And as I kind of go into in detail in the report, it's more complex than that.
Yeah, I mean, issues like space debris.
Yeah,
right?
exactly.
I mean, these are not seemingly consequential issues from a military or commercial perspective, but space debris is an issue. Yeah. Satellite constellations is a concern in terms of coverage. I mean, so there are a lot of, there's a growing number of like singular issues that space intersects with that have practical, maybe not militaristic, but practical implications for societies across the world.
And actually, I'm glad you bring up space debris because that is one of the examples of issues that, depending what interpretation of space security concepts you take, it either is or isn't. For other experts, it's more of a space safety issue because debris, of course, can be natural. It doesn't have to be intentionally created, where some experts draw that line between intentional and unintentional hazards. But I've actually found that for experts in the region, that distinction doesn't matter. At the end of the day, if I've spent all all this time, all this effort, all this, resources into launching that 1 or 2 satellites or whatever it may be, I'm still concerned about debris, even if it's unintentional, right? And so I think that's important too. There's similar concerns about space safety.
Is the stat 30 near misses? Every satellite has about 30 near misses of space debris.
I don't know that stat.
I think that was the stat I remember. It's quite a large number of near misses where satellites have to be navigated to miss a piece of debris that's...
And let's unpack that, I mean, from a cost investment standpoint. So every time you maneuver, you are expending fuel. Sometimes you can't maneuver, right? Either because of the, your requirements on your mission and so there's a risk that you're undertaking, but then also, are you making your missions last less as a result of that? Do you trust the data that you're getting that tells you to move? So there's a bunch of different issues related to the space traffic coordination side of this, but certainly debris and the risk of collisions is one that the region really cares about.
And there was an intersection with the military or weaponization space with anti-satellite missiles, and the Russians, I think, tested one against their own satellite in 2023, 1,500 new pieces of space debris, something like that.
And China has tested some a couple times, India as well. So, and that's another feature of, I go into one of the areas that I think countries spend a lot of time debating is what is the biggest concern when it comes to space security. For countries in the region, weapons is a big concern, but there's also, that is one of the areas where there's a bit of a distinction among the United States and some of the other experts, because one of the things we've been pointing out for a long time is there's no set definition of what a space weapon is. It's really hard to determine intent in orbit, and especially if there's concerns about attribution and things like that. But you get into these testing of anti-satellite weapons, which, the United States took a major step in 2021 with a moratorium. We issued a moratorium saying we're not going to test these types of weapons anymore because of the responsible generation of long-lived debris. And so that has become that has driven some forward momentum around, okay, maybe we don't agree on what a space weapon is, but let's talk about the type of behavior that we do want to see or we don't want to see, and at least make progress there, right? And so that has been an issue that's actually been popular and I think has really crystallized in the region as well because of their concerns, not just from the weaponization standpoint, but also the creation of this debris that is not going to discriminate. It's not going to pick your satellite over mine.
That's right. It's going to hit what it hits if you can't move. And so, I mean, and I have a question about sort of bilateral and smaller coalitions forming. And maybe in the spirit of that, I'll ask, about sort of there seems to be somewhat of a split between two poles, right? Sort of a Western-led and maybe a Chinese-Russian-led pole in terms of governance and who's writing the script in terms of the norms and so forth. I mean, I was always surprised to see, I think we're still operating off the 1972 Outer Space Treaty for the most part. 1967. Man, I wasn't born yet. But yeah, that's this idea that we've been operating off a really outdated treaty. And you have two, this is not a pun, but two sort of constellations of countries that are forming to build their own set of norms and governance. Can you talk a little bit about that, sort of those two poles?
I think those poles have become a little bit more entrenched, more polarized in the last few years. That won't surprise us. I mean, space dynamics reflect the dynamics here on Earth, and so where you have conflict on Earth, you're going to see it on space-related issues as well. But I think that's, again, where our region, countries from the region play a really productive role, because there are issues where they're saying, we don't need to pick a side, we just need to agree on behavioral, But yes, you see these blocks forming to a certain extent on some of these multilateral forums. And so in the Conference on Disarmament and Space Security Conversations, for example, Russia and China have been advancing this treaty for many years, the prevention of the placement of weapons of outer space. But the United States has pointed out there's no verification, going back to a lack of definition. And also it doesn't include some things that we find concerning, like ground-based ASATs. It really is limited to orbital placement of weapons and things like that. Doesn't prevent the testing of them or development, et cetera. So again, back to behavior. And so I find it encouraging, even though, sometimes you get a lot of focus on, countries joining the International Lunar Research Station, which is a moon exploration initiative led by China, versus the Artemis Accords, the Artemis program, which is a U.S.-led effort. There's a lot of focus on that, but I like to point out where there's areas of alignment, right? And so no creation of debris. I point out, for example, Costa Rica is one of the countries that issued that moratorium as well and say, we will not conduct kinetic anti-satellite testing ourselves. And I just find that fascinating and, again, significant because I don't think anyone was really concerned Costa Rica would do that.
I was going to ask, is Costa Rica testing anti-satellite weapon systems?
No, but I like that it saw the value of helping create that norm of we're going to add our vote and our voice to on the side of saying that behavior is not okay. So
if we ever develop the capability, we won't do it.
Exactly. And so again, I think it's just an opportunity to think about, it's not just your number of satellites that determines how much impact you can have on space governance debates. There are other opportunities to kind of shape that dialogue.
And it is about developing norms and what is acceptable behavior in outer space given the complexity and how space is being operationalized in all those different domains we talked about. Mm-hmm. So we talk about sort of multilateral fora and multilateral arrangements. Can you talk a little bit about what your findings in terms of more the bilateral nation-to-nation engaging on some of these really complex space issues? I think right off the bat, sort of U.S.-Argentina, dynamics and discussions around space, but talk a little bit about the bilateral, your findings on bilateral and these smaller sort of consensus-driven blocks that look to tackle specific issues. Yeah,
so one of the way I unpack the space security debates, I already mentioned differences over threats. The other one is differences over mechanisms. Some countries, especially in the diplomatic space, they want to see treaties, legally binding treaties, whereas others, increasingly, and the United States among them, is saying, okay, treaty would be great. It's kind of a long road, but let's focus on non-binding measures that we can reach agreement and start building those norms, right? But the third category of debate is forums. And so initially, and more its diplomatic history, the region has always been like, we need to talk about space security in the CD and in the UN. But as I point out, you see increasing flexibility with that. Again, not minimizing the impact or the authoritative nature of that forum, but kind of saying we will talk about space security in other environments, which, to get to the question you were asking, I think creates some opportunities for engagement, but then also I think from a U.S. standpoint, some concerns. So one example I talk about in the report is BRICS. The BRICS alliance, was hosted in Brazil last year. And the BRICS declaration actually included a lot of statements related to space and space security, even though, as we know, BRICS is not a formal multilateral body. It's, if anything, it's a strange economic, political alliance, with new members and
but competitive. I mean, the BRICS countries are competitors amongst themselves too. Yeah. But it was largely, I think, defined to some degree in opposition to sort of a U.S.-dominated economic landscape.
And so to see space security show up there, but to get to your question, that doesn't mean that the Brazilian and the U.S. military have not been able to do joint exercises and we see that across the region, where even if in the diplomatic stance, countries are maybe espousing, points of view that appear very contradictory to how the U.S. presents those same perspectives, we're still having, they're participating in global Sentinel exercises. We're still doing space data sharing agreements with them. And so there's these parallel tracks, and I think it's more to, institutional differences and evolution of these perspectives rather than saying, oh, Brazil or Argentina or Chile or Mexico is a monolithic entity. This is what they care about. And, it's not a yes or no question.
There's a lot of gray.
Yeah,
and I think the other thing that you do in the report well, and we've had conversations about this, and I've heard you speak on this before, is that there's these vast differences between countries, there's also vast differences between sort of civil, defense, and different sectors within
Yes.
society that are engaged in space. I mean, notwithstanding the private sector too.
Yes.
Do you want to
exactly.
talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, sure. And I every so often I try to bring it home and think about, would I expect full alignment between, say, one of our space agencies, NOAA, our weather agency, right, and the Space Force on the same issue? Not necessarily, right? Their lanes are different, their perspective is different, and so that heterogeneity is also reflected on the other side. Now, it is hampered or I said exacerbated by the fact that these are emerging ecosystems where, you look at a country like Chile. Chile expertise, operational expertise in space has always been in the Air Force. They don't have a civil space agency. Whether they need one, that's a separate question, but they don't. And so what that means is that I find sometimes some inconsistencies or differences between what I see that community saying about space security than what I see the Ministry of Foreign Affairs saying. And they're the ones representing Chile in the diplomatic and multilateral forums. And so understanding those differences, but also understanding why that, it's only been in the recent years that Chile has been trying to take more of a national approach to space versus a very operational, functional, right?
Well, and that's a great point, because I suspect if Chile, for example, sort of rests its space, kind of equity in the Air Force, how does that speak across to civilian agencies hosted by other countries? I suspect they don't speak the same language, and they don't see the same, threat landscape or sort of requirements, and so
Exactly.
now you have this disconnectedness, not just across countries' capabilities, but across the types of organizations that are in the lead role within a country.
And what drives decisions and what might impact some decisions. So, to stay with the Chile example, last year at HSC, at the Hemispheric Security Conference, there was a lot of focus on, this collaboration involving a Chilean university and a Chinese scientific and state-led, organization, and there were space security concerns. I was not surprised that the university had not thought about those space security concerns, because it's not their role. And so you depend on an integration that needs to happen so that when a potential international partnership comes up, then you can have the military folks or the defense folks say, hey, this is a concern because of ABC. And so you need to have the right person make the decision, but informed by all these different equities. And in an environment that's shifting so much, because just to really foot stomp your point, we do see private activity in the region. There are universities doing a lot of important work. There are civil actors. And so if those networks aren't really robust, you get decisions made kind of in a patchwork fashion, or you get what I talk about in the report, which is different views around the same issue. I don't think this is going to last forever. I think this is going to shift as those positions coalesce. But right now, from a U.S. standpoint, we need to know what those positions are so we can inform engagement.
Two excellent points I want to echo. One, the Hemispheric Security Conference. That's coming up again. I'm going to use this opportunity for the shameless thank you. I promise that was not choreographed, but our Hemispheric Security Conference is coming up again, May 5, 6, and 7 in Miami. We will have a space discussion. Laura will be on that panel, I hope. This is me formally asking, okay?
Yes.
Said it. It is
we have witnesses.
It is on the record.
Yes.
And I think the second, which again is all joking aside, which I think is really important, is that space is a whole of government, if not whole of society issue. Mm-hmm. And countries have to approach it that way, as a whole of, again, the implications on telecommunications and military. So I think that's a really important point, is that countries need within themselves to have sort of a more holistic, whole of government, interagency coordinated approach to how they deal with space, because the different agencies have different equities. Mm-hmm. And those aren't going to be captured in how nations advocate for that in the global stage, right?
And how they evolve as those positions, as issues evolve, right? Whether it's a space security concern, whether it's conflict, or whether it's more positive opportunities, right? Where we want to see a more holistic approach to how countries handle these issues. And I will say, I used to work for the U.S. government. We could improve our own interagency coordination.
I got questions on that right now.
And so, but we have those channels, we have those mechanisms. And in fact, I talk a lot about us continuing to do better, more so we can model that behavior on the other side and force those connections. So one of the things I talk about in the report is, in the national security strategy that was released in last November, there's languages in there about commercial diplomacy, right? It'd be great to see that thought through from the space standpoint, right? And so bridging, okay, if we have the Space Force and Southcom driving capability use in terms of space situational awareness, is there an opportunity for U.S. companies that are providing that capability, right? But that means that's across several agencies, several communities, and so it's possible for sure because we do it with other partners. As I've pointed out, we do these strategic dialogues with Japan, for example, a very strong partner of the U.S. So it makes sense. I would like to see something similar in the region where maybe those partnerships aren't yet as robust.
And maybe that is just sort of a doubling down on space diplomacy. Right? I mean, we did this in the cyber domain, right, in which we had digital diplomacy that sort of helped color the lens in the technology landscape as it pertained to like cyber and emerging technology, and space is no different. So I'm going to ask you a series of questions on the U.S.
Okay.
And then I got one sort of forward-leaning question, and then if you have questions out there, I'll take them. I see one in the chat already, so I'll weave that in here in a minute. So one of your findings suggests, and I think you were just touching on this, but I want you to unpack a little bit more. One of your findings suggests that alignment with U.S. space security priorities tend to increase as you move from diplomatic institutions to defense institutions. And so what does that mean for how the United States should think about partnerships in the region?
So I talk about when you look at the diplomatic statements, for example, there's a lot of focus on non-weaponization, non-militarization in some cases. Even a country like Brazil, as I mentioned, whose defense doctrine is starting to move more towards concerns about space security and even potential development of counter space measures to protect assets eventually. If you look at the defense documents, you get that sense. But I found some quotes from the diplomatic world where they also raise concerns about even counter space capabilities as potentially destabilizing. So that is one example of maybe the gap I was talking about before. But I don't say it to panic. I just say it more to be like, okay, then maybe in our diplomatic engagement, we can actually reference that we are doing collaboration on SSA and on things that we both care about, even if the narrative hasn't fully caught up. Because as you can imagine, diplomatic stances take a longer time to evolve. On the civil side, in the United States, our civil space agencies don't have a formal role in space security, but what they do work on is some of the related areas of understanding the environment, developing the best practices. And so I think, and that is, as we talked about before, that is a concern as well of both military and civil actors on the other side. So back to the point of us kind of getting our act together a little bit, I would hate for the answer to be, okay, if NASA doesn't have a counterpoint on the other side, NASA is going to engage with a civil space agency, then that conversation doesn't happen. Where those lines are a little bit blurred on the other side, and there are issues of alignment, right? So I go through country by country to show, okay, this is what the defense documents are saying, for example. And I find so much alignment with concepts of space superiority a little bit differently than we define it, but really about being able to assess, understand, and respond to threats. That's our jam. And so I would like to see more work to kind of bolster what that cooperation looks like, even if on the diplomatic side, again, there may be a little bit more distance because there's narratives around creating a treaty, which, as I said, the U.S. doesn't, that's not what we're focused on. Let's not let that limit coordination and cooperation that could occur in other areas.
That's a great point. Okay, so I'm going to ask you to pull out the crystal ball.
Oh, gosh.
This is the part of that conversation where I want you to kind of lean forward. And as space becomes more strategically important, do you see coordination within Latin American governments improving? Or do you think institutional fragmentation, which is somewhat what you've painted the picture of in your report, that will remain a defining feature of regional space policy for now?
I think it's going to vary by country. I think some countries are making important steps to better integrate those pockets of expertise and create more of a holistic point of view about these issues. But part of it will depend on our own engagement and modeling behavior. I mean, rightly or wrongly, because I think there's so many models about how to do space around the world, but we are kind of the best. And so a lot of leaders and countries and actors look at the US model. I worry that they're going to replicate some of the things we don't do great. But where we could model is that interagency, that whole of government approach, whole of sector actually, because like we can bring in the private sector, we can bring in academia and researchers, right? And in us informing our own engagement with the region that way, I think could make a lot of progress in what the coordination looks like. I expect there's going to be some concerns, accidents, things are going to happen that are going to force the need for greater coordination. Unfortunately, I think
that's usually what happens, right? It's
exactly.
It's crisis that drives some of the most compelling and forward-leaning moves to sort of address some of these issues.
And so I'd like to think that at that point, we will have enough connective, tissue across the region where we can pull on those partnerships and say, okay, this is what we can do together. The region. One of the obvious reasons why doing space in the region makes sense is there's a lack of infrastructure on the southern part of the world, right, on the southern hemisphere, and so that has been historically what has driven a lot of great power competition and focus. But I think we can look beyond that. We can recognize that and be like, it would help us to have more assets in the southern hemisphere. But given that these countries are so interested in developing autonomous capabilities and again being able to protect the assets they already have, I think that's the bridge to build.
Yeah, and I guess to your point, if the U.S. is again pivoting, prioritizing its engagement in the Western Hemisphere, certainly space is a vertical that becomes critically important to the U.S. getting it right.
Yeah.
And so, to your point, we have an amazing opportunity in front of us to deepen the relationships we have across sectors in the region in ways that I think continue to build at least a hemisphere that's clearly aligned with the protection of sort of space security.
Mm-hmm. Advancing space security, I referenced the United States Space Force International Partnership Strategy, and our leaders have talked about space as a team sport, right? And so even if we're developing all these capabilities to maintain space control and really kind of dominate in this environment, we know we need those partnerships. And so this is a little bit of a way to say we shouldn't, we have strong partnerships elsewhere around the world, Europe and Japan, as I mentioned before, et cetera. But here in our region, I think there's a lot of promise for things we could do together.
All right, so I have one question online.
Sure.
And the question is, as AI becomes more central to analyzing satellite data, how might AI change the way governments, institutions in Latin America use space-based information for policy decisions?
I think AI is going to show some of the functional gaps of who has the expertise. We talked about Chile, but you can see it in other parts of the region where who has the expertise to know how systems operate, to query the data the right way to know that it's been validated, especially if you're using AI to make decisions or interpretations, right? And so it really, I think it's going to shed some light on some of those gaps. I will say the region is being very forward-leaning on AI at the same time. I would hope that they see those opportunities for leveraging AI for the use of space in a way that helps drive some of these interconnected tissue, right? Because this is a space where it really benefits from private sector innovation, universities, and then the government providing the use cases, providing those controls and that authoritative kind of perspective, but really leveraging that expertise. So AI could be a good bridge, but I also worry it could show some of those gaps.
Yeah. And I think in showing some of those gaps, the challenge of addressing those gaps, because it becomes even more diffused and fragmented, right? In terms of who's going to manage that. Is it a private sector or a public sector, ask, and how much does the private sector want to evade sort of addressing some of those issues because it may undermine the commercial solvency of some of those things.
Right. And where are you placing the risk? I think a lot of the choices, at the end of the day, it's a trade-off, right? And a lot of the choices that governments and other actors in the region make are about, am I going to develop this capability myself, even if it's going to take me X amount of years? Am I going to purchase it, open myself up for certain, risks? Am I going to maybe do it collaboratively? I think that conversation around those trade-offs is something that I think we could really contribute and be a part of in a way that benefits our own interests as well.
That's a great point. Any questions from anyone here in the room? No? We're good? Yeah? All right. Go for it. Give it to me. And I'll put it on the mic so everybody can hear.
No. I just wanted to know, how vulnerable are these regional satellites to cyber attacks? I don't know if you can expand.
So the question was, how vulnerable are satellites moving across the region to cyber attacks?
That's a great question. So we see that the bulk of the cyber attacks that occur are not actually in space; they're in the ground. They're, interrupting the information flow. They're on the ground systems. And, you've heard of spoofing, for example, which is like confusing the signal of, say, your GPS receiver. And so that's where we see the bulk of those activities. And it's a great point because there's an important overlap between space security and cybersecurity, even though they're, slightly different domains. But again, back to the fragmentation. And sometimes we do that too here. If you become a cyber expert, you're not necessarily thinking about space. And if you become a space expert, you're not necessarily thinking about cyber. So back to, I think AI, cyber, all these kind of emerging technology concerns highlight those blurred lines and those shared vulnerabilities. But to answer your question, cyber is absolutely a concern because, you see, for example, in the region, there are ground stations that are, shared capabilities that are operated by foreign powers or they're operated by non-state actors. If they're not tracking some of these concerns, they could be opening themselves up to, risks that they just didn't sign up for, right? Because they're not necessarily thinking about space security as part of, something you need to care about with your assets on the ground.
Any other questions?
I have another one.
Go for it. You should come up here. You want to come up here and get
No.
Go for it.
I know earlier you were mentioning the need for space assets in the southern hemisphere.
Mm-hmm.
How exactly can we get more space assets there?
So a question about space assets in the southern hemisphere. When you referenced it earlier, it's sort of lack of coverage and.
So the coverage has to do with these ground infrastructure because you basically need to. You benefit by having as many eyes as you can on those assets that are orbiting the planet, right? And we have the bulk of the global ground stations are in the north, with some in the south, right? And so that is that one concrete example. But there are other capabilities that the region uses. Relies on that are operated by other parts of the world and other actors where there could be opportunities for new capabilities. So one example is this is something the Latin American and Caribbean Space Agency that was recently formed has talked about is the region obviously is super affected by weather and climate events. They don't have their own weather satellite. They use data that's captured and shared globally and openly by the United States, by Europe. That's great, but granularity really matters, and so you could have an additional asset, maybe develop collaboratively and augment the capability of the region to get even better weather and climate forecasts. So that's I think there are some capabilities that could benefit the region if they were developed as
more infrastructure. Yeah.
Exactly.
Any more questions? Those are great questions, by the way. Anyone else? All right. Laura Delgado López, mapping space security concepts in Latin America, implications for U.S. engagement. Laura, it's been a great conversation.
It was
Thank you
so much fun.
And
yeah.
It's a real pleasure and honor to have you on the team. And this is the first of what will be many reports coming out that help provide thought leadership on space policy for the Americas. So